All right, so welcome. This is the webinar on supporting children through abuse-related trauma. Thank you for joining. So at the beginning of all of our webinars, we do like to have this reminder to take care of yourself, right? So it's not uncommon for people who attend our webinars to maybe have some trauma responses to the webinar content, or maybe even after, working all day, especially now because this one's in the evening. You might just need to take care of yourself in other ways too. So needing support or grounding for any other reason. There's a lot of current events and racial injustices and things to be aware of, and things that may be impacting how we're showing up to the webinar now too. And so we want to honor and recognize that and encourage you to tend to any of your emotional, physical, and holistic safety, security, and other needs as well too. So we do have some resources on the screen here if you do need to reach out to anyone, or just chat and have someone else know what you're experiencing, or just kind of have someone else be in your company and walk through some things with you. So we do have some resources on the screen if that is something that will be helpful for you today. So we encourage you to do that as always. So a little bit about the next 90 minutes. So these are kind of the three main objectives, and we'll be breaking the presentation up into those with lots of opportunity again for engagement. We will also be offering certificates of attendance if you attend live or even watch the entire thing on our YouTube channel as well too. So we'll send instructions on how to request that later. But these are the three things. So we'll kind of get into that right away with how children experience and are impacted by abuse-related trauma. So in terms of kind of like who we are and who Women's Advocates is, if you haven't heard of us before, we are one of the first domestic violence shelters in the United States. We're located in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were founded in 1974, but our advocacy started for particularly helping women at the time navigate divorce and a legal name change. And they were realizing that the women that were calling were at a crossroads between, do I continue to endure abuse in my home, or am I homeless on the streets by myself or by with my kids? And the legal advocates that kind of started that hotline wanted to create a third option for those callers, and was able to rally up enough money 2 years later in 1974 to have an official shelter operate out of the Victorian home that you see on the very left on the bottom here. That was the first home, and then it's expanded into 3 interconnected homes where we now have about 50 women and children that stay with us daily. And so you'll see our mission on the screen really reflects what we hope to do, which is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. And in terms of that cycle, it's kind of referring to both the intra-relationship cycle, so the fact that it takes on average 7 to now even 12 attempts for someone to be able to successfully leave an abusive relationship. So kind of breaking that intra-relationship cycle, and also the intergenerational relationship cycle, or the cycle of domestic violence rather, in terms of we have women who come to our shelter who come with their own children and tell us that when they were kids, they came to Women's Advocates with their own mother. And so trying to kind of break that cycle. And one thing that sometimes does get missed when we conflate domestic violence with intimate partner violence is the impact on children. And so that really underscores the importance of this webinar, and probably why a lot of you are here, is to look at, how are children impacted and how can we truly support children through these experiences. And so if you are curious of learning more about Women's Advocates, you can visit our website. But I'm really curious to learn sorry, I'm like tripping on my words today. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about you all and kind of what motivated you to join. So I'm gonna launch this poll here, and you can select multiple options. And if there's something that doesn't best represent why you joined, you can feel free to add that to the chat as well too. I also see a request in the chat of reading the slides as much as possible, which I will definitely do my best to do as well. So thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge um, that I see that in the chat. All right, just taking a look at the chat, and I'll give just a few more seconds for this poll here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So it looks like 50% reported that they're a social service provider looking to help parents support their kids. And then the next most reported response was, I work with children in another capacity. That, and that's supposed to say that has not been mentioned. So thank you. I'm assuming you knew what I meant when I put that option. So a lot of us do work with children or have our own children, and we're looking to support them. So that's helpful context for me to know moving forward. So thank you for joining and kind of sharing your reason for why. All right, so that first objective is, how do children experience and how are they impacted by abuse-related trauma? And I was really ambitious when I was putting this PowerPoint together, as I normally am. So if this isn't your first webinar with me, you'll know that I do try to add as much resources and information as possible into these 90 minutes together. But I think that this quote from Charles R. Swindoll is really representative of kind of what this section talks about. So Charles says, each day of our lives, we make deposits in the memory banks of our children. And so I think that's absolutely true in a lot of different ways as well. And kind of thinking about how adverse childhood experiences and also experiences within the home can impact children when they're children, but also people who are adults and are childhood survivors of abuse as well too. So a little bit more about children and trauma. I think that trauma has definitely become more of a buzzword these days. It's something I'm seeing a little more frequently, and being able to think about, okay, well, what is trauma? What is a traumatic event? And on the screen here, you'll see a traumatic event is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. And so some of the things on the screen you'll see that kind of are conceptualized as trauma or can be are things that include violence within the family, homelessness, economic stress, natural disasters, poverty, racism, neglect, serious illness, community violence, bullying, school violence, crime, loss of a loved one. So those can all be examples of trauma. And kind of thinking about the impact of child traumatic stress and how that can have a continual impact on the mind, body, and spirit or soul, as well too, even after that potentially traumatic event has ended. Today, we're going to be focusing a little bit more specifically on abuse. So I wanted to include more information about child abuse and abuse within the home, and thinking of what is that kind of constituted as and who does that involve. And so a lot of, child-help.org and things have done research of it's most often a caregiver, a caretaker, or family member who is causing this harm. And it's not, there is a heavy emphasis on physical harm, but there is a huge component of emotional abuse as well too that may not be something that people are as aware of or may be on the lookout for as well. But I think in this definition, it mentions making a child feel worthless, and also includes physical harm and also sexual contact, and also things of neglecting in terms of food, care, shelter as well too. And so the importance of acknowledging that, unfortunately, child abuse is a public health epidemic, right? So it's something that can happen in all types of families, regardless of any of their social identities. And there's a lot of different forms, as I mentioned as well. And in this graph, there's a huge chunk that is reported physical abuse. and then sexual abuse, and then the next is emotional neglect, physical neglect, and then emotional abuse as well too. And so this isn't always indicative of what is experienced, it's more so what is reported, specifically to this agency of child help. And so I think it does give a little bit of a picture of there are a lot of different forms that child abuse can take, and that all of them are equally, they're all still considered abuse and very hard, difficult and detrimental, to a child's development and sense of self, which we'll talk about more. In terms of how prevalent child abuse is, it is an epidemic, right? And so a lot of these, again, are contingent on mandated reporters, which I'm assuming many of you are. And so a lot of them still go underreported as well too, but you'll see kind of these percentages of 80.1% of cases of child abuse, the abuser is the parent. There's 7.5 million children who have experienced, or their experience of child abuse has been reported, and even being lethal, right? So 5 children die every day from child abuse too. So kind of really understanding the importance of this conversation and how it's really important for trusted adults to be advocates for children who are in these challenging, of course, and really vulnerable situations as well too. Particularly in Minnesota, and I acknowledge not everyone is in Minnesota, but I did want to include some statistics from our state since Women's Advocates resides in Minnesota in terms of some of the disparities of the disproportionate rates within American Indian and Alaska Native Indigenous communities. So children are 5 times more likely when compared to white children, and also multiracial and African American children were 3 times. So just being aware of those disproportionate rates, and also this number of 58.7% of children were ages 8 or younger, in terms of child maltreatment, specifically in Minnesota. And so I think there sometimes can be some question of, oh, do children at a certain ages, do they really know what's going on? So we'll talk about that just very briefly later on as well too. But if you're interested in any of these reports or learning more, I link them on the screen too, so you can look into it more. But I think sometimes it's important to root in how prevalent child abuse is, and how, if you are working with children in any capacity, there is a very likely chance that you have worked with a child who has experienced or is currently experiencing child abuse. So this next slide is talking about how children are exposed to abuse in the home, right? So we talked about the different forms very briefly, and this webinar is focused on supporting children. So we do have more webinars that kind of break down what the impact is and how children are experiencing it, and what we hear directly from the children that we work at Women's Advocates, and also in community and collaboration with other early childhood therapists at places like the Domestic Abuse Project, and they share more of their experiences and case studies as well. So we will link those later on if you're interested in learning about that more, but just so we all are coming from the same context of kind of what we're talking about is that, children can be exposed in a lot of different ways. So it can be from seeing the actual incidents of violence, so being present during it, maybe looking through a door, maybe they're hearing threats or fighting noises. So maybe the parents or the adults in the home, they don't know that the child is home, or that the child is awake, or whatever the case is, because they're not seen. They can't see the child, but the child is still hearing these threats and noises, where they know that there's an argument taking place that might be scary. They might even be able to feel the violence through vibrations in the walls or floor. So even if you're not hearing the explicit words that are being said, I know if you've ever lived in an apartment, you've probably been able to feel if there is tension or something concerning happening in the unit over. And so children can absolutely pick up on those things as well too. There can also be this direct experience of violence through coercion, force, intervening, or being assaulted too. So in terms of directly experiencing those forms, and that's where this box here is what comprises a lot of those statistics from the previous screen in terms of what is being reported. A lot of times it is either they're being coerced to do something or they're forced, or maybe they're even intervening. So we've heard of and even seen children who will kind of like use their own bodies as a barrier between the person who is being abusive and the person who's experiencing that abuse. So maybe physically intervening or maybe screaming or trying to do something to divert the attention away from the person who is being harmed. And then maybe they're being assaulted themselves as well. So that could be like emotionally, verbally, physically, and a lot of different ways too of creating a really unsafe environment for that child. There's others of observing the aftermath. So maybe they are picked up from school, or they're coming home from a friend's house, or, they're waking up the next day and they can tell something happened the previous night because there's a broken mug on the counter, or um, there's blood that wasn't fully cleaned out of a t-shirt or anything like that. They can kind of pick up on that as well. And again, even just being aware of that tension within the home or within certain circumstances. And I think one thing, and I personally have learned a lot about how trauma kind of lives in the body and things like that through trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga, and they have these ideas and a lot of research behind it of this idea of interoception versus exteroception. And I mention that because children who live in abusive homes often develop their exteroceptive abilities where they are really highly attuned and aware of the actions, the mannerisms, the expressions, the tones, the energy that is being put out by other people around them, and that they are using that information to, dictate how they need to act or or kind of giving them a sense of what's going on in the home and kind of really developing that awareness really, really early on. And so I think that's something to definitely be aware of. And that interoception is the ability to kind of tap into oneself. And so sometimes that is what is at an expense of their exteroceptive abilities are really heightened. Because they're used to catering to other people and trying to keep the peace or trying to do things to make that other person or the other people happy or appease them, that sometimes they deny and kind of turn off their ability to tune into their own bodies and what's going on in their own minds, in their own world, because they don't feel like it's safe to do that. And so that's something we'll talk about a little bit later on as well too, when we talk about kind of how trauma impacts the body. But we do have another poll, so I am curious to know more about which form of exposure of the ones that I just mentioned, which are you most concerned about? And again, you can select multiple and add more context in the chat too if you would like, so I'll give a few moments for that. I see in the chat some people are talking about having experienced domestic violence themselves, whether that was in childhood or adulthood, and becoming an advocate. And that is something that is really common. We know from studies that approximately 70%, maybe even more, have of domestic violence advocates or people who work within the trauma field have experienced that themselves. And I think there's a lot of great value that is had from being able to to kind of tap into your own experiences and have that deeper level of kind of like empathy and understanding of where survivors are coming from. And so I think that definitely is something to acknowledge and be aware of. Um, I think there was a question about, is separation of mother and child due to court abuse considered in the definition? So maybe you're asking about the definition of trauma. I think one thing that about trauma is that it is really defined by that person, and it is hard when you're working with children. But in terms of court abuse and separation of, yeah, I think that definitely could be considered traumatic, depending on the impact on the child and everything as well too. Um, yeah, some people are sharing some of their stories in the chat of surviving domestic violence as well too, and also having children and sharing custody. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that I'm happy that you're here, and thank you for um, being able to share. And if you're not seeing some of these messages, some of them are sent directly to the panelists as well too. Um, all right. So DV, someone asked what's DV? DV is an acronym for domestic violence. So thank you for that question. Okay. Try not to get too pulled into the chat. You all have really wonderful things to say. But to keep us on time, it seems like a lot of people are mostly concerned with that direct experience of violence, which absolutely makes sense. And there's a lot of others that were chosen as well too, witnessing abuse and using their body to intervene physically or verbally. And then people are also really concerned about seeing abuse as well too. So that makes sense, and we'll keep that information in mind as we move forward. So these are some immediate reactions to abuse. So this can be reactions to that direct exposure, indirect exposure, any of those different forms. Children can have these reactions as well too. And it's important to think of this like developmental approach. We don't have time to kind of get into the developmental aspects of things, but we do have more webinars that talk about that with a trained early childhood therapist that talks about that. But on a more kind of broad scale, we'll see some of these different reactions of anxiety, depression, and aggression. And those are some things that some people wonder, like, oh, can children really experience anxiety or depression? And I think that definitely is something that children might be able to kind of learn from things within the household of maybe reenacting certain aggression that they've seen. It's not uncommon for, some of the children that come to our shelter with their parent to maybe, you know, we'll see them screaming and cursing at the mom or, slapping and hitting them. And a lot of that is learned, right? That's a learned behavior. And it can be really difficult to see and witness, of course, but understanding from a trauma-informed lens of that reenactment. And we'll get more to like how to support a child who's kind of displaying those things. But avoidance is really huge too. They might have behavioral issues. They might be told in the different spaces that they're in, whether it's childcare or at school, that they are fighting and being really oppositional or throwing tantrums or things that are maybe developmentally regressive. They might have these feelings of guilt or they might blame themselves. And we'll talk about that a lot more later. Hyperarousal, so, maybe by any slight touch or anything like that, they might get hyperaroused by other kind of stimuli. They might have these physical complaints. So something that's really common to hear is having headaches and they don't know why they're getting them, or having really bad stomach aches and kind of having that manifestation within their body too, if they don't really have the words fully maybe to always describe what they're experiencing or what they're witnessing, but they know that their body's having this reaction physically too. Sometimes we see that it's really difficult for children to concentrate when they are having things going on at home. Maybe they're having a hard time, completing their homework because they're so aware of the tension in the household that they can't focus. And so those are some things that come up as well. We also have a lot of other things on the screen of re-experiencing, maybe repetitive talk or play. So maybe they're repeating something that they heard over and over and over again. Maybe they have a really hard time with sleep. So maybe they're having nightmares. They're having a difficult time waking up in the morning. Maybe they're kind of falling asleep in class. There might be like bedwetting and things too that might be, again, like developmentally regressive, but might be a reaction to what's happening in the home. Perfectionism, overachievement. So that can be the opposite of that poor academic performance, where they're really hyper-focused. And they maybe have this belief of, oh, if I can be, a straight A student, then, my parents won't argue anymore and they'll love me and all these things too. Or maybe they just need something else to focus on. So they throw all their energy into their achievements at school. They might have some passiveness, so maybe they just agree with everything. Maybe they learned in their home that, they're not allowed to have an opinion and that they just um, need to either just agree with everything, or even like make themselves really small, and make them so like they don't want to be seen, because when they are seen, sometimes they feel hurt. So that, or maybe they are displaying more aggressiveness of being forceful or being really, really angered over things that they maybe used to not get angry about, or things that they're not able to like regulate their emotions. So we'll talk about those more too. And another reaction is this like immense worry. So maybe they have worry for the person who's experiencing the abuse, or maybe they're afraid to be separated from both of their parents. So they might again have that distress of like constantly having this anxiety and worry through headaches and stomach aches as well too. And feel free to add any other immediate reactions that maybe you've witnessed when working with children in the chat as well too. Um, there's a message in the chat saying that children do not always understand that they're being abused, and therefore they may not know how to verbalize the abuse. Adults also tend to overlook this form of trauma because they discount the actual effect on the kids. Yeah, I think sometimes, especially if there aren't like physical bruises or things, sometimes like, I don't really know what's going on with this kid. And I think that especially when we're children, we are learning so much through observation, right? And if that's all we've ever known, if all we've ever known is abuse, it does start to become normalized. And sometimes it takes time for children to be exposed to other children, or go to another a friend's house and see how their parents interact, and start to wonder, wait a second, that's not how my parents interact. And kind of having that as well too. But again, like not being able to verbalize it. And we'll have a lot of different resources for that as well too. But thank you for adding that in the chat as well too. Um, there's also another chat about how perfectionism and overachievement, and also passive and aggressiveness, can lead adults in the child's lives overlooking their pain and not seeing the need to check in with them until something drastic happens. Yeah, so I definitely agree. And that's something that we've seen too, of even, parents saying, oh, they don't really seem impacted, they don't talk about it. But that is definitely something of like, if adults, if teachers and other individuals in their lives are kind of saying, oh, this is an appropriate response to things, or they're doing really well in school, so we don't really need to pay attention to that child. I definitely think that is one of those reactions that is overlooked, but can often be something that is masking a deeper pain and impact that you might not be kind of attuned to as well too. Um, all right, so I don't want to spend too much time on everything. But I invite you all to write in the chat, what thoughts do you think children develop when they're exposed to or directly experience abuse as well? So these can be any thoughts about themselves, about their family, about their world, their core beliefs, what relationships are like. So I invite you all to kind of send that in the chat. Of what thoughts you think children might have, even if they aren't able to verbalize them or explain them to people. What might they start to learn over time if they are in a home that is abusive? So I'm seeing in the chat, it's my fault. Children might be starting to think that fighting is how you settle disagreements. They might think that there's something wrong with me, or that it's they deserve the abuse, that every adult will react that way. They're not worthy of love. They don't have value. They might say they think that they're worthless. And make sure you're sending your message to all panelists and attendees too, so we can see as well. But getting other people mad is dangerous. I think that's a huge one too, of like not being able to experience a wide range of emotions, right? Of like, these emotions, if I exhibit this, then I'm automatically this person who's abusive. They might start to believe that pleasing others is key, that they can't do anything about it. They might say, yeah, I hate it here. They might think it's normal. They might think that violence is an answer. They might feel negativity about human beings. Yeah, like at a very young age, they can start to have that view as well too. They might think they don't deserve better. The world's not a safe place. That they're the problem. Um, that violence is normal. That people are for hurting. Low self-esteem, learned behaviors, um, substance abuse, maybe fear of the parents divorcing, fear that it means that they're not loved, um, that adults are not reliable or always there to care for youth. Um, People can't be trusted, that their voice doesn't mean anything, they can't tell anyone, the world is unsafe, they have to protect the parents. Um, yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to read every single one of these, but these are um, really, really insightful. So yeah, these are definitely some thoughts that children can develop when they're exposed to or directly experience abuse too. Um, and if it's not safe for you to think of those thoughts, you can absolutely opt out of any of these engagement opportunities. Um, yeah. Okay, thank you for sharing that in the chat. These are some, I wanted to keep it very simple, but there's dozens in the chat too, from people's direct experiences of working with children or being childhood survivors of abuse themselves too. So I appreciate everyone's vulnerability and engaging with that. But these are some that we've heard of: I'm bad, no one will love me, I'm stupid, it's my fault, I must have wanted it, I must have done something wrong. These are really, really hard thoughts. And I, again, encourage all of you to take care of yourselves through all of this. But these are some thoughts that children can start to develop. And getting into the support part of the webinar, which I think is really important, of there are a lot of tools about kind of like shifting those core beliefs. And so there are, and all of these are hyperlinked too. So you can click on the links once you get the slides. But if you are an advocate or even a parent yourself, or working with children in any capacity, kind of integrating these activities can be helpful. So having them complete sentences of, something that my friends like about me is something is blank, or I'm proud of blank, or my family was happy when I did this, or in school I'm good at this, or something that makes me unique is fill in the blank. And kind of practicing having these self-esteem things, because that can be a really huge hit of not feeling like you have autonomy, not feeling like you get a choice or a say, or that you are a good person as a core at your core. And so working on this with children is really important too. And I acknowledge this picture right here for the self-esteem journal is really hard to see. I'm even struggling to see it, so I'll read a little bit of it. But it has basically a spot for each day of the week, so Monday through Sunday. And it kind of has, again, that fill in the blank too, of something I did well today. I was proud of someone else, or today was interesting because of just starting to increase the awareness of like, what are these beliefs and how can we shift them to be rooted in that they are worthy, that they are lovable and they are loved, and that they're cherished and cared for, and things that might be contrary to what they've learned through their own experiences growing up. So that is one tool to kind of address some of those thoughts that can come with experiencing or being exposed to abuse. So moving on to some emotions. So what emotions do you think children experience when they witness or are abused? And you can also, again, add in the chat if you had any other resources for shifting those core beliefs as well too. That's something you can definitely add in as well. So now we're thinking about emotions. So children will feel guilt, fear, anger, confusion, sadness, helplessness, anxiety, tension, maybe numbness, jealousy, anger, tension, distrust, self-doubt, anxiety. Absolutely. Feeling inadequate, feeling guilty, Feeling lonely, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of really big emotions that children feel and often feel like they have to suppress, or that it's scary to have those feelings too. So thank you for adding that in the chat. There are again, so these are some of the big ones, and a lot of them were already mentioned, right? So being really irritable, or maybe even like bored or apathetic, or maybe antisocial, or different things that can manifest in a lot of different ways. They might be really startled easily, or they might have difficulty sleeping, or say things like, my brain won't shut off, and that might be an indicator of experiencing anxiety. They might even have some like, and this should say swing instead of wing, but mood swings. So they might feel like really extremely happy and extremely sad, within moments notice. They might again have fear, that a lot of that worry and fear as well too. And so we have this wheel of emotions, to kind of work on children's like ability to describe and name their own emotions as well too. So that's why kind of these faces are really important too, of like, what does my face look like when I'm happy, or what does my face look like when I'm annoyed, or I'm experiencing feeling nervous or really antsy, or maybe they feel kind of disgusted or gross and stuff. So this is a great tool to be able to, and again, there's a lot of different versions for different age ranges. So this might be accessible for children within certain age range, and it also depends on that child too, of like what they resonate to. So there are other tools as well, and we talked about that exteroception, but for interoception, of noticing like what's going on in the body, some of these exercises might be really really difficult for children to do. So you might show them this and say, where do you feel sadness, and then so on the screen you'll see that the put in a color, so maybe they put blue for sadness, and they paint blue, on their eye where their eyes would be, and then maybe in their chest. And then happiness, maybe they feel that like in their heart or in their stomach, and they paint that as yellow. And fear, maybe they paint that as green, and they put it on like in their shoulders, because maybe their shoulders tense up when they are feeling that emotion. Or anger, maybe their face gets really hot when they're angry, and maybe they ball up their fists, so they put some red blotches on their hands. Um, so those are all ways to kind of start to connect, because we do know, right, that our minds and our bodies are connected, and that it can continue to live in our bodies. And that's why there's a lot of different somatic, kind of like somatic experiencing, and even like play therapy too, that can help children kind of get into their bodies and kind of tap into their own resources, and being able to navigate like, how do I feel this, what do I associate with these different emotions. And I think one of the biggest things, right, is being able to give them space to feel those big emotions, and that oftentimes they feel like they have to suppress them, or that they're not allowed to feel them. So giving them an opportunity to think about, why do you feel this way, or what did you do about that feeling that you noticed? What is something else that maybe you could have done? And there's some examples at the bottom of like, maybe you could talk to a friend, tell an adult, maybe take some deep breaths, pause whatever it was that caused that emotion, or, ask for help, and saying that it's okay to feel the way that you're feeling, and being able to have those affirming experiences is really important as well too. So being able to explore those emotions can be really important. All right, and then I already alluded and talked about this a lot too, but if you have any other thoughts about how you think, or how abuse related trauma can live and show up in the bodies of children too. So I'll give a moment for people to send some things in the chat as well. I'm seeing, yeah, having accidents at night or in school. They might have behavior change. They might go revert to like thumb sucking, destruction of personal items. They might have like physical injuries, so their bodies might be impacted by that. Right, they might have loss of bladder control, so they might pee their pants, or they might think that they need to be punished, or they might have illness due to lower immunity, right? Like just feeling sick all the time. They might have headaches, stomach aches. Again, those things we mentioned are like issues with concentration, maybe aches and pains, right, in the bodies as well too. They might self-harm. They might have be susceptible to certain diseases or behavioral issues or have that regression. They might not smile. They might have very consistent illnesses or anger outbursts. Um, I'm trying to see if there's any, yeah, low energy. Maybe their sleep is really, really impacted. And we know our sleep is really correlated with our development and our growth and everything too. They may not want to eat, right? So their eating can be impacted. Um, they might have attachment issues. They might have nightmares, poor hygiene. There's mention of like lying. And so it can show up in their bodies in terms of last time I felt this way and I was honest, I got hurt. They might overeat. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that it shows up for sure. So these are just a few. We try to keep it really simple. And so these were the ones that were reported a lot, and also things I saw in the chat a lot too. Of we might hear children say like, my tummy ache feels like a big flaming ball of fire, and then maybe being encouraged of, yeah, blow on it until the fire goes out. And if they have, these nightmares, maybe you can kind of sit with them and say, what happened in the nightmare, and focus on kind of recreating a happy ending of like, how could that dream have ended better, and can we envision what that happy ending would look like. And again, if there are accidents that happen, trying not to shame them, just changing the sheets, not making it a big deal, because they might feel even more shame about that experience as well too. So just kind of, taking care of them, making sure that they get fresh clothes and things too, and that a reminder that they're loved too. So those are some somatic experiences for sure. There's a lot of information on like belly breathing, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. There's even like 5-finger breathing too, which children really love because it is a little tactile. So you kind of just trace your finger, and as you're tracing up, you inhale, and as you trace down, you exhale. So you kind of go through the whole hand when you're breathing. And there's a lot of like creative, fun ways that I've heard from past webinar attendees too that they've used with kids too, in terms of like square breathing and just other things to kind of focus their attention and be in their bodies. And it can be a tactic of things that they use to like, name all of their favorite dinosaurs, or, have some kind of task to kind of bring them to the present moment and kind of focus on that as well too. There's also been a lot of research on progressive muscle relaxation. So again, that might not be safe for some people, right? It might not be safe to feel that tenseness in the body. It can be really helpful for some people in terms of like, children who struggle to fall asleep. That might be a helpful thing to engage in, but for others, it might be more triggering. So that's something to absolutely be aware of too, that with all of these, being able to tailor it specifically to the child is really important. There's a recommendation in the chat of A Volcano in My Tummy. It's a book that someone in the chat uses with youth. So I'm going to add that to my notes, so I can maybe add a link to that in a follow-up email if people are interested in that. Great. All right, so we'll take a breath. That was the first objective. And so we have, about 2 more left. And this next one is about how to talk to children. So these last 2 are kind of the biggest focus of like, how are we talking to children about their experiences? How are we making space for that? And how can we truly support them in our different unique roles in the community as well too? And so again, with my quotes, I really enjoy this quote by Peggy saying that the way we talk to our children becomes their inner voice too, of like being able to take accountability of how we are impacting the children that we are engaging with, as well too, and how we it can be an empowering statement too of like we can help shift that inner voice too if it is one of, the thoughts that we mentioned earlier of I'm bad and all these other core beliefs that children can learn from their own experiences. And so taking the power of like how can we transform those thoughts by the way that we talk to them and the way we engage with the children. And so I do want to launch another poll about what your current confidence and comfort level is with talking to children about abuse. And there's another activity in the chat mentioned about using Coca-Cola and Mentos to describe to younger kids about how bad feelings build up and end up in a volcano and their tummies coming out in an explosive episode. Yeah, of like even that metaphor of the beach ball, right? If there's a beach ball and you're pressing it into the water and you keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it down, one day when your arms are fully extended and you can't push it down anymore, the ball will spring up and hit you in the face. Of like, how can we find safe, supportive ways to let those emotions out before they feel, all consuming or they manifest in ways that are harmful to themselves or to other people. All right. So it looks like 40% of people are saying that they're somewhat confident and comfortable talking to children about abuse. 31% say they feel confident and comfortable. 15% said they could bring up the topic of abuse if absolutely necessary, but they wouldn't feel comfortable doing it. But they would do it if they needed to. So yeah, there definitely is a range of the comfort and confidence level, which totally makes sense. And we're happy that all of you are here and that you can all contribute to this conversation for sure. All right, so this is a little bit of information that we found about how kids tell and when kids tell in terms of if they are experiencing abuse in the home, what are things that can prevent them from telling someone else of what's happening? And then what are circumstances when they do sometimes choose to tell a trusted adult or even a friend or someone else what's going on? And so there's a lot of different things that can prevent a child from feeling like it's safe to be able to talk about what they're experiencing, what they've witnessed. So again, one of the main things is they don't want to upset their parents or their family. So even if they haven't been told explicitly, hey, don't tell anyone this, a lot of children can kind of internalize and figure that it's not something that would be okay for them to share. So they might fear increased, escalation of abuse if they do. Again, they might not feel safe telling someone. They might feel that they would be harmed or other people would be harmed more, or that they just don't feel comfortable doing it. They also might be really confused, right? So they might not entirely be sure about like what's happening, what's going on. So that confusion could prevent them from telling someone. They might be scared and they don't know why they're scared. So then they don't really want to bring it up to someone because they don't have an answer. They might be groomed, manipulated, or threatened by people in the home or even like other family members too, especially in the cases of sexual violence. Again, maybe they're being told they're not going to be believed if they do reach out to someone else. So those are definitely a lot of barriers for children to be able to access and feel comfortable or safe telling someone what's going on. In the event that we find that children do let other people know what's going on, it can be under a lot of different circumstances, but some of them include when the perpetrator is no longer in their life. We hear that a lot about sexual violence too. So like maybe if the uncle or aunt or whoever cousin moves away, then maybe that's when they feel more comfortable or more safe to be able to say, oh, this person did something to me. Or maybe when they know that the perpetrator no longer has access to them. So maybe it was a parent and there's a divorce or a breakup or they move out or something like that. So those are some instances too where it could be going on for years and they don't tell anyone until that circumstance happens. It could even be when the perpetrator has passed away. That's something we've heard a lot as well too. And then telling a teacher or a school counselor after a safety discussion at school. So we have talked about healthy relationships and also about abuse within relationships and within family members at middle schools and high schools. And we have had a number of people who have, sat and listened to the presentation and said, wait a second, I think I've experienced something like that, but I thought abuse was only blank. And so they kind of excluded that from it, or they say, oh, wow, like this is something that my school is actually telling me is important and we're learning about this. So maybe they'll care if I tell them. So then they'll reach out to either like our presenters directly, or maybe reach out to a teacher or school counselor following that education. Um, and it also might bring up conversations with other students too. So they might talk about those presentations that we give and say, oh, wait, like other people seem to have experienced that too. It might be okay for me to talk about my story and my experience. It might also be when a child figures out what is wrong, and or maybe wants the abuse to stop. So maybe for a while they don't really know what's going on, and then they might realize, or they might get fed up with it and say, I don't want this to be happening anymore. I need to tell someone. Again, it could also just be when the child feels safe and trusts another person. It could also be an accident. So maybe they'll describe something that happened and they're not saying, I'm scared, or, this is abuse or anything. They might just say, oh yeah, sometimes like children can be really, really honest and talk about things that have happened, and they might not even realize, and that can be cases if they tell someone at school and then CPS is involved, and that is a common story as well too. So there are a lot of kind of different things for that as well too. I'm looking at the chat, and there's some information about with the divorce and domestic violence, it can be difficult to bring it up as a grandparent. Um, I'm just looking at the chat too. Yeah, sometimes even after an abuser is out of the picture, they can still be told that they're lying and that they're not believed. And that can be like, okay, well, why? What's the point of telling people if I'm just going to be told that I'm a liar? Um, right. Some might say they might not say anything, but they might draw or color the abuse. Yeah. So we're actually going to talk about that later too, about kind of art as a therapeutic tool and also a way of communicating, because some children, don't really know how to describe that using their words. And so sometimes they can describe it using other forms as well too. So we'll talk about that. So a little bit, if they do use their words and they describe things, these might be some things that you'll hear of, um, in their perception too, of like, oh, it seemed like they were both hitting and yelling at each other. Why isn't this other person getting in trouble? And so it's not uncommon for children to see, both of the caregivers as equal parties in the violence. So they might not be able to tell like what is self-defense and what is that like initial aggression or assault. Again, what a lot of you have mentioned in the chat of children perceiving that violence is their fault. So they might say things like, oh, if I would have done this, or if I hadn't done this, then they wouldn't have started fighting. And they might say, everything's fine, it's just my fault. Or they might say, if they try really hard to be good, they won't fight again. So again, thinking that they can control their caregivers' behaviors. And maybe not believing that the protective caregiver is not hurt if there wasn't a physical sign of injury. So maybe they'll just say, oh, but I don't understand what's going on. They were only yelling at each other. I didn't see anything. Or similarly of, maybe this person only punched the wall, didn't, hit them physically, and not understanding, right, those like underlying threats and other using, destruction of property and other things to intimidate and instill fear and threaten another person. Or saying like, they stopped crying right away, so can we go home? So feeling like, oh, they're only in danger, they're only upset if there are tears or other things kind of involved with that. Or maybe believing that once the fighting stops, everything will go back to their perception of what they believe was normal. So those are a lot of things to talk about as well too. All right. Trying to keep an eye on the chat. So a little bit more about, right, making space and navigating these tough emotions. And so kind of as we were talking about all these other things and what their perception is and what's going on in their minds and how can we talk to them about it, there is a really great resource of like these worry coping cards. So, right, like the cards might say things like pause and listen to the sounds around you, or can you draw a picture about your worry? So there's a lot of those like artistic things too, like can you draw this? Or can you even think of a place where you feel calm or comfortable and happy, like your happy place? What does it look like? What does it sound like? Can you imagine how good you feel when you are there? um Maybe even like if they're really really worried, write about your worry and maybe try to make the ending positive, or write about how you solve a problem, relax, or start feeling better, or handle your worry. So those are a lot of different resources for that too. There's also one about exploring those fears. So, a lot of people in the chat talked about a lot of different fears that children might have of being separated or being taken away, or of their parents no longer being together. So, having these exploration questions of what are some things that make you feel nervous or scared? What do you think about when you're nervous or scared? Again, tapping into like the emotions, the feelings, the thoughts, and what's going on in the body. What's something you can do to feel better next time when you're afraid? So, again, you know, some of these might seem obvious, but being able to have continual times to go back and invite them to say, yeah, like tell me more about what makes you nervous and scared, and that we're a partner and I can work with you together on how to navigate and how to work through some of these fears. Um, and then there's another about what is anger. So I know in the chat some people talked about like noticing aggression and these really big feelings of anger and displays of like, oh, okay, well, I see like people in my home be angry all the time, and this is how they handle their anger. So having this tool of like, again, being able to maybe draw that picture, maybe think of what's something you say only when you're angry, and just like building that awareness. So again, like list some things that cause you to feel angry, and then trying to create another list, hopefully that's a little longer than the list of things that make them angry, is a list of healthy things to do when they feel angry. So being able to think about kind of those coping mechanisms and self-regulation, and being able to acknowledge and say, anger is a normal experience of being human. But what is okay? Like, what is a healthy way to channel my anger and allow that to exist where it's not hurting myself or other people? And then kind of talking more broadly about speaking to children about abuse. Again, being really honest as you can with them. Again, providing those continual opportunities to ask questions is huge, because we know from working with children, if you ask them one time, like, how are you feeling? It's that they start to learn how, and think of like what you're expecting them to say. But if you continue to ask them, there might be a chance where they'll say, actually, you know, I feel more comfortable now to be able to tell you how I'm truly feeling or what's going on. So again, not just like, oh, I asked them one time and they said they were fine and everything was fine, but having those continual opportunities and allowing them to say, you can ask me any questions that you have. And encouraging that curiosity and communication as well, being able to build trust with them, talking about what is trust. And I think even like Brené Brown has a really great model. If you look up like Braving Trust with Brené Brown, she talks about boundaries. And I know a lot of people are interested in having a webinar about setting boundaries, like healthy boundaries with children. And so hopefully that will be something we can do in the future. And also like reliability is a big component of trust too. So, are you following through on the things that you are saying that you're doing or that you will do? Another is like that accountability. If you don't follow up on the things, are you able to take accountability and say, me as your caregiver or as, your child care worker or advocate or whatever the case is, I take accountability for these things, and being able to have that. So a lot of different things, integrity and non-judgment, and also that generosity, right? Of like both of you being able to assume, the best of each other, and extend that generosity to one another as well too. And taking that trauma-informed approach too. So thinking of ways to collaborate and like center the child's feelings and provide the child with choices and autonomy, of course, within reason, but being able to say, and anything, and we noticed even with the shelter of saying, which backpack would you like? This one, or another one? And not saying this is the backpack you have to have, but allowing them to have those little choices can make a big difference too, of realizing that they do have autonomy, that things aren't just happening to them all the time, that they can take certain actions in their life too. So finding ways to give them those different choices and options can be really helpful, and making them feel safe enough to maybe talk about abuse as well. Again, using that developmentally relevant approach, using language that they'll understand, maybe tools and things that maybe they really love. Maybe they love superheroes, and using that as a way to talk about things. Just kind of tailoring it to things that they are really interested in and that they'll be receptive to. Again, respect is super huge of, how can we both feel that mutual sense of being respected and cared for as humans. And also, again, right, having these conversations about holistic safety. So I know when we talk a lot about safety planning in general within the domestic violence field, our minds immediately go to, oh, have a takeaway bag and have things like save money and stuff like that for physical safety. But thinking about, we have an entire webinar too on emotional safety for children. So I encourage you to check that out if that sounds like something you're interested in. But having those conversations of like, what does it mean for you to feel safe, and sharing your own experiences with safety too, of like, oh, it makes me feel safe when um I'm able to share my opinions, and I feel like you're not going to judge me, or you're not going to hate me for the feelings that I have, or makes me feel, like holistically, and you can use a different word too, of like really truly safe in our hearts, um when I can make a mistake, and I can tell you I made a mistake, or I can, all those different things are huge components, and it's not limited to just that physical safety of not having like, um, because having, insults and being berated with, you're not good enough, or you always do things wrong, or something's wrong with you, that can make someone feel really, really unsafe without a hand ever being raised to them, right? But having those healthy connections with the self, of like, how do you feel about yourself? How do you feel about other people? Things like that are really important to think about as well. I do see a lot of things in the chat. Um, um, it's important to respect them by talking to them as honestly as possible within their age group. Yeah. Um, um, okay, sorry, I'm just looking through the chat. Thinking, teaching critical thinking skills, fostering discernment. Yeah. All right. And there's another question about, will participants have access to the PowerPoint or recording the training? Yes, all of this will be sent to you. So the PowerPoints and also the link to the recording will be sent shortly after. Okay, we're gonna keep pushing through. I just want to make sure I am attending to like the chat and stuff. So if people are having questions, I want to make sure we get to them. And I know that I think about 40% of people on this call said that they are social service providers. So I wanted to make sure you have some information about how to talk about trauma, and specifically abuse with children. So a lot of this we've already talked about, in terms of like recognizing any and all those feelings as valid. Again, making sure we're not, sometimes we unintentionally use the language that is shaming or blaming. Um, Again, maybe allowing them to lead the way in their sharing. Right. If you are a mandated reporter, just kind of being, because that's something that can break trust a lot too, of um, if they think that they're telling you something in confidence, and then they realize that a lot of other people are aware of what you told them now. Allowing children to decide how much they want to be a part of parent or family recovery work. So again, that's something that we talk a lot about with the early childhood therapists. So I'd encourage you to look into those too. But those are just some basic level things about kind of talking about abuse. We also have some more tips for parents. So maybe if the parents are the ones that are experiencing that abuse, there might be a parent that says things like, violence is never okay. I'm sorry that you saw that. You didn't cause it. It's not your fault. So kind of like you might have to repeat some of those things of saying, that must be really scary for you. Tell me how you feel about it. I'm doing my best to keep you safe. Let's talk about your safety plan, things like that. If the abusive parent is seeing the child and is in communication, they might, reiterate some of these things as well too of my behavior is not okay, violence is not okay. Um, I'm getting help so that we can be safe. If that's something that applies, that might not always be the case. But again, being able to have certain things that are said and try to counter some of those thoughts that they might learn over time. And then again with emotion, so I think this is a really useful tool and something to do in general. So regardless of if children have experienced abuse or not, being able to do these check-ins, right? So tapping into their emotions with them with the emotion thermometers. So having them like put a name to their feelings and rate the intensity of those feelings too. So you'll see on the screen it says like not happy at the bottom, and then at the top of the thermometer it says very happy, in the middle it says happy. So then there are some of these ranges and you can have them color in the thermometers or like make a single mark to indicate where they are on that range. And also kind of shows them that they can experience a lot of different emotions at the same time as well too, and using that to even share and model yourself. So you can say, today like something happens and I'm feeling really worn out and I'm feeling really sad. So you might go through and do your own coloring and model that behavior, and they might feel comfortable to share how they're feeling too. So using that as a check-in routine, and maybe asking them to say, hey, you and your friend got into an argument today, and after, of course, tending to their needs, even asking, how might your friend feel, or how might this other person feel, and kind of allowing them to work on their empathy skills, and also thinking about that, which a lot of children who experience abuse might not struggle with that, again, because of that exteroception of being really aware of how other people are feeling. So they might be able to do this activity really well when describing how others feel, but not how they feel themselves. So that's something to be aware of as well. And then like another big thing in terms of talking, right? So there are these small talk family discussion cards too of creating this continual inviting environment for kids to talk about their world too. So just having, maybe every week you sit down and you play a game, and every time, they get go fish, or, whatever the game is, or you can just sit down and look at the cards and ask them kind of these questions, and be able to create this environment where they feel safe talking about things regarding their family or things about their feelings. So that's another tool to kind of use as well too. All right, this is the final objective, and we are kind of short on time, so hopefully we'll have enough to get through most of the resources in this objective too. But this is kind of talking about building support system, techniques, tools, and also resources to promote that holistic safety that we've been talking about. So there's this quote by Edith Egger from this podcast with Brené Brown, Unlocking Us. And she says, love is spelled Time, time, right? And I think that that is really huge for this, of being able to give ourselves time, and kind of that expression of love. It's time together, whether it's quality time and also time to heal and process and everything as well too. So I am really curious. There's like two word clouds that we're kind of gonna be making together. So the first one is about what does the holistically, so emotionally, physically safe child look, sound, and feel like. So you can scan the QR code, um, or click this link that I just sent in the chat. There's a question of, do you have the resources in Spanish? Yeah, so a lot of those are from Therapist Aid. and Therapist Aid has a lot of their resources available in Spanish. So I'll try to link those in the follow-up email as well too. So thank you for asking about that. Um, so you can pull out your cameras on your phones and scan the QR code or click the link in the chat, and we'll start to build this word cloud together of what does a holistically, emotionally, physically safe child look, sound, and feel like. Oh no. Okay. You almost saw all of the answers. Okay. So let's see what people are saying. So the thing with the Menti is as people add words, if that word is repeated, it gets larger. So a lot of people are saying they associate happy with feeling holistically safe, confident, engaging, expressive, secure. Healthy, safe, right? Positive thinking, smiling easily, self-accepting. They might be calm. It feels like love. It feels peaceful. They might have, these sense of humor. Again, if you're having any trouble adding to the chat, you can adding to the word cloud, you can add in the chat too. So in the chat, I see people say resilient, safe, self-regulating. Smiling is getting bigger and bigger. I do like that one. Laughing, right? Being able to be silly, being able to, bright, outgoing. For some kids, they might feel more talkative when they feel safe. They might feel warm, playful, yeah, jumping. They might be feeling very present. So again, like if they are experiencing depression, they might be really focused on what's happened in the past, or if they're very anxious, they might be really focused about the future and what could happen then. Yeah, so thank you so much. You all can continue to contribute to this. I'm going to exit out of it out of sake of time. But yeah, these are some things that we've come up with of, an emotionally safe child, from the early childhood therapists have talked about, right? Being able to freely move throughout the world without hesitation. They might be able to reference adults and get needs met. So they might feel more comfortable asking questions, having these pleasant interactions and share joy. They might be able to have these experiences and also share these range of emotions freely. Sometimes when they're emotionally safe, they can um, experience those strong emotions and also keep their bodies safe. Or they are able to connect with new adults and form healthy relationships with them. They might feel comfortable being vulnerable, like admitting mistakes or asking for help. Or even learning from the caregiver's emotional experiences and asking questions about those. And again, really like that silly and goofy creative and being able to share those sides of them with adults can be really indicative of that child feeling emotionally safe. I see there's another question of how is safety planning relevant to mandated reporters? For example, there's retaliation for the child's disclosure. Yeah, so we actually have another webinar that talks about that a little bit more in depth too, but I would just say broadly, safety planning can be discussed of, can be like emotional safety in terms of that, but right. So if a child is explaining something and they are trying to tell you, please don't tell anyone and things like that, and you do, and you can explain to them and again, right, collaborate with them and say, I'm going to tell you the process, these people might come, or they're on their way and your parents might be involved. What do you need to feel supported, or how can we approach this together? And thinking of those different, and there'll be a thing later in a few slides too about safety planning. And so I might bring that up again as well too. But it is, and I do want to acknowledge it can be really tricky too of talking about trust and things when you are a mandated reporter. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. So there is a poll this is the last poll of how can we tell if a child doesn't have emotional safety? So again, this is a multiple choice. You can select as many as apply. Um, what are ways that we can tell if they don't have that emotional safety after we've kind of talked about what that looks like and what that feels like? What are indicators that they don't have it? Give a few moments for that. Okay. So the most is struggles to accept help or affection is a really big indicator to us about if they don't have that emotional safety. Absolutely. Others are saying hiding emotions, seems concerns that adults can't help with strong emotions. Maybe they stuff their emotion away. Maybe they have these emotional explosions that seem disproportionate to the situation or that they occur really frequently. Or only expressing emotions in certain settings or with certain caregivers or trusted adults. Yeah, so those are definitely things that we've come up with that might be some indicators. Other people are also saying that suicide ideation might be things that could be an indicator. Maybe poor boundaries with other people. So it could be like really porous or really restricted boundaries. They might be unable to learn or focus on anything too. So that might be like they are not emotionally safe at home either. And so that could be a way that it manifests as well. So thank you for participating in that. These are some ways that emotional safety can be affected by children who witness domestic violence. So, again, that fear of vulnerability, needing to prioritize physical safety of self and others. Maybe they're not learning ways to regulate emotions safely, especially if they don't observe, their caregivers consistently regulating their emotions. They might like really suppress them. They might share bits with others and then pause to gauge the reactions of them too. So seeing how much they can really trust that person, kind of like testing the waters. Some people are also saying in the chat, heightened interest in self-help books or books on the subject of emotions, latching on to friends in a way that causes issues with friendships. Right. So there might be kind of attachment that they've learned of like having this anxious attachment. Um, Absolutely, yeah. So a little bit more about how we can actually support emotional safety in children. So we had a whole again that emotional safety for children webinar, and these are some things that really resonated with some of the folks about validating feelings, right? So giving children a sense of control over their own circumstances of emotion, helping them connect to their emotions and experiences. And again, communicating that you, as a supportive person, that you're listening and that you value the opinion of that child that you're supporting. And again, always being like curious and inquisitive of asking questions. How do you feel? What was that like for you? What are you thinking about? And again, respecting no's and answers. So if the child says, no, I don't, well, not continuing to press them and allowing them to come to you and giving them that time to think and process. Um, and so those are some ways that we can support emotional safety. There's a lot of other ways in terms of like nurturing children. So I always add like those Maslow hierarchy of needs too, of that being really important to think about in terms of, children have that as well, what their physiological and their safety needs are, and also the belonging and love needs and all of those things too, of being able to provide that emotional security, that trust and respect and affection, and again, still being able to provide, discipline or, what are rewards for things or what are things that you can expect as consequences of certain behaviors and things of still being able to have those healthy boundaries and being encouraging and supportive. Um, And so a big part of that is building this network of support. So thinking about the child that you're working with or that you're supporting, or your own child if you're a parent, who are the people, the trusted adults that might be able to support that child. So I know a lot of children have specific teachers that they really trust and appreciate and feel comfortable sharing with. So that might be something. Maybe they do have an individual therapist or family therapist. Maybe it's shelter staff if they are at a domestic violence shelter like ours. Maybe school counselors or extended family members, maybe advocates, other people that act as caregivers as well. So just thinking of continuing to build that network of support. Um, and being able those people within that network of support, how are they modeling emotions? um, can they narrate those emotions as they occur? Maybe they make that inviting space, right, for those big emotions. Maybe they have the a calming corner or other things too that don't feel like timeout, but is a space to actually kind of process those emotions. Modeling the strategies, so maybe modeling taking deep breaths when they're feeling big emotions, taking a break, pausing, saying, hey, this is getting really frustrating. What if we went and got some ice cream? Or what if we went and, started coloring or doing other things too, asking them to help choose, oh, I'm feeling this way. What do you think I should do? And kind of involving them in that process too. And maybe even sitting with them. So maybe they don't need to be fixed right away. Sometimes that's not always possible to fix it. And so being able to sit with and say, what can we do with this? And how can we explore this emotion and allow it to exist? And then again, with that vulnerability, maybe talking about hard or difficult things, involving sharing those difficult emotions, kind of just modeling that for them too. So the main thing with this is we can support them through kind of demonstrating that, especially things that directly can counteract the abusive behavior that they've experienced or witnessed. Again, these are the 5 components of trauma-informed kind of advocacy approaches. So thinking of ways to incorporate all of this in your work with supporting children can be really helpful. And this is what I was talking about, that like emotional safety plan. So these are things that you absolutely can do, like as a mandated reporter, or as someone who's supporting a child of like, what do you think, feel, and act within all of these different things? When you're feeling upset, what you can talk to, where can you go, what can you do? What are the different um, you know, resources and things. I also linked this children's safety plan on the top left here. So that has, I'll click on it really quick actually so you can see it. So this is for younger children, for sure. Um, but kind of talking about being safe at home. So this is probably a better resource for that mandated reporter question. And they talk about hand safety planning, right? So like, who are the 5 people that you can go to about these different things? How can you access them? Um, and kind of having special codes, having special ways to kind of communicate about certain things. So that's another resource for safety planning if that seems like something that would be helpful for the children that you work with. And then as a family, so these are some more resources. So if you are, working with parents and families, and they say, what can we do? Like, can we have a mindfulness schedule? When we wake up, can we tune into our 5 senses? Can we do a body scan when we're eating? Can we do a mindful check-in about like how we're feeling, or describe the food we're eating? What is the colors? What does it smell like? What is the texture? When you're traveling, maybe you play I Spy or do the alphabet game, like name things that start with certain letters. Maybe you make certain bracelets together. So whenever you notice the bracelet when you're wearing it, you take a breath. Maybe do that square breathing, right? Of like inhaling for 4 seconds and holding it and exhaling for 4, etc. Maybe you make a mindfulness box. So like a physical box of something that you can do of like, these are things that are really calming for them or things that make them feel safe, and putting that all in a box. again, maybe that progressive muscle relaxation is something that they do before bedtime and you do it together as a family. So those are some tips. There's also about kind of thinking of the family system as a whole of my changing family and complete the sentence of, if they are experiencing a separation or just different changes of like my family's different now because my biggest worry is this, things I don't like about the changes. When I think about my family, I feel a certain way. My hope for my family is this. And so being able to make space for those things too as they're happening can be really important. Again, I did mention art as an outlet, right? So there is this mask project. And so that's something that we were talking about earlier. Sometimes children might not have the words for it, or they might not feel comfortable sharing verbally. So if you give them a project like this and say, okay, pick one of these three images that feel like represent you the most, and that you resonate with, and they'll pick it. And then you say on the front, you can draw a picture of how you think other people view you, and then you can ask them, and then on the back you can draw how you actually see yourself. And so you can see that there might be a discrepancy, right? There might be some differences on how they're perceiving themselves to be and how they think other people. So they might say, other people think I'm really happy but I'm actually really sad. And so that's an opportunity for that too. And then also, right, like this personal coat of arms. So having something that represents them in each quadrant. So this can again help with that self-esteem, help them kind of think of their own self-conception of who they are in terms of, their own family. And then at the bottom in the little ribbon, writing a name that summarizes their own personal coat of arms. So art can be a really great tool. And those are things that, families can all do together as well. And the very last one, I promise, and I wanted to leave on this positive, kind of inspiring note because I know you all have really wonderful ideas about how you will support children. Who may be impacted by abuse related trauma. So you can write, and it's not just a word, so you can write as many words as you want within reason. And we'll all see them displayed on this screen about how you are going to support. So it can be things you learned in this webinar, it can be things that you thought of while you're engaging in this webinar, things that you're already doing, so we can all get a sense of an idea about that too. And I do see some requests in the chat of understanding discipline and boundaries for children who have experienced abuse would be a great future topic. And so I'll make a note of that and reach out to the Domestic Abuse Project because we partner with them a lot, because they do a lot of really great specific work with children and families together who have experienced abuse too. So I'll talk about that and see if that's something we can get in the future. So I'm seeing some people saying providing a safe place for for children to talk. Um, some might share their stories, and that um, of others who have been through abuse and domestic violence by proxy. Plan to use a lot of what was implemented in the training, learning a lot as a parent, maybe use education. So again, I'm going to pull it up to see if people are able to. Um, okay, yeah, so it seems like there's been a lot. Let's see if I can see them all. Here we go. Giving them a safe space to express themselves, love and listen without judgment, believe them, start where they're comfortable, helping the parents, helping them cultivate better communication, art therapy, art play group, encouraging them to talk about their emotions, helping them build trust and understand healthy relationships, creating safety. Prevention, being a positive person, offering a safe and encouraging space for them to work through their experiences. Yeah, these are all really, really wonderful ideas. And so I really appreciate you all taking the time to add some of the ways that you'll support children. I also see in the chat actively listening to children, meeting them on their level, removing any bias, reminding myself daily that the children have lived their own experience and is equally as important to acknowledge for them as it is for their adults. Absolutely. Women's advocates, we believe that all victim survivors are the experts of their own experience, and that applies to children as well too. And while we might have been on the earth longer than them and have greater awareness and understanding of things, they are always going to be the one who has the most information about what they've experienced. People are talking about, art being a good outlet, exploring the feelings. Uh, yeah, absolutely. So on the screen, I have some more resources of, um, I have the National Child Abuse Hotline on here, and then a lot of different things. So I keep mentioning the Domestic Abuse Project. They're really wonderful. We've also worked with Greater Minneapolis Crisis Nursery and also the Family Partnership too. They do a 2-generational approach to therapy as well. So involving the parent and the children together. There's a lot of being able to learn more. We have a lot of different resources, and I realize we're at time too. So I do want to thank you all so much for coming. We do have our live chat if you have any questions that you want to ask. We also have an entire playlist on our YouTube channel that specifically talks about working with children and supporting children who have experienced abuse. So we'll make sure you have a link to those other webinars as well too. Lots of other resources, so that will be linked and also included in the PowerPoint slide that you'll get. These are even more resources from other webinars that we've given to, so if you're curious about that, there's so many others. It's really hard to talk about everything in just 90 minutes. Sometimes I feel like we're only just scraping the surface. So I just want to make sure you're all equipped with so many resources that you would want. And we really encourage you to connect with us online. So we have a Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and also our YouTube. So following and subscribing to all of that, maybe even adding our 24-hour crisis line to your phone in a contact if it's safe for you to do that. You have our email on the screen as well. So outreach is great for anything related to the webinars. And then resources is a great one if you are looking for, child-specific resources. We can always help you with that too. And so I just added a link of post-webinar survey. So we'd love to hear from you of what worked well, what was missing, what would you like in the future, any feedback. We are always looking to improve. And then there also is information about how do you get a certificate. So I'm going to send the instructions in the chat. And if you're watching the recording, you'll email the email on the screen. So outreach@wadvocates.org. Make sure you include the dates and the name of the webinar that you're requesting the certificate for, and also your name as it should be displayed on the certificate itself. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.